Hi everyone, my name is Sumant Kumar from Some Thoughts Online, and today we will be going through part 2 of the rise of nationalism in Europe. Remember, this is the first chapter in the history textbook for 10th standard CBSE students, and if you already haven't gone through part 1 of this chapter, I would recommend that you first check that video out and get back to this one if you want a better understanding. You can use the link that I've put up in the description below. We begin this part with the defeat of Napoleon and the emergence of conservatism as an ideology. We will also be talking about the revolutionaries and the age of revolutions between 1830 and 1848. You will remember that we ended the previous part with the rise of liberalism and the liberals who wish to overthrow the absolutist leaders who control Europe. First, we must study about the re-emergence of nationalism after Napoleon's defeat in 1815. Following the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 at Waterloo, European governments were driven by a spirit of conservatism. Conservatives wished to preserve the established traditional institutions of state and society, such as the monarchy, the church, social hierarchies, property, and the family. Most conservatives, however, did not propose a return to the society of pre-revolutionary days. They realized that modernization could in fact strengthen the traditional institutions like the monarchy. It could make state power more effective and strong. A modern army, an efficient bureaucracy, a dynamic economy, the abolition of feudalism and serfdom could actually strengthen the autocratic monarchies of Europe. It's important to understand that after Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo, the ideology of conservatism began to evolve. Now, these conservatives wanted to return to the old absolutist institutions, but by adding a modern touch to it. The conservatives wanted to modernize their industry, they wanted to create better economic policies, and they wanted to modernize the military in order to maintain the hierarchical form of society that existed before the French Revolution. In 1815, Britain, Russia, Prussia and Austria, who had collectively defeated Napoleon, met at Vienna to draw up a settlement for Europe. This congress was hosted by the Austrian Chancellor, whose name was Duke Metternich. The delegates drew up the Treaty of Vienna of 1815, and this had the objective of undoing most of the changes that had come about in Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. They restored the Bourbon dynasty in France, which had been deposed during the French Revolution. And they set up various states on the boundaries of France to prevent French expansion in the future. This included the Kingdom of Netherlands in the north, Genoa and Piedmont in the south. They gave Prussia new territories on its western frontier, while Austria was given control of northern Italy. They gave Russia a part of Poland, and Prussia was given a portion of Saxony. You will understand all this if you look at the map of Europe. However, the 39 German states created by Napoleon under the Civil Code of 1804 were left untouched. The main intention of this Congress was to restore the monarchies that had been overthrown by Napoleon and create a new conservative order in Europe. Napoleon and his armies had managed to introduce the ideas of French nationalism to multiple territories during the Napoleonic Wars. However, the Congress of Vienna wished to undo this and introduce their own version of a modern conservative society by restoring the monarchy and the nobility. Obviously, there were many drawbacks to this restoration done by the conservatives. Conservative regimes set up in 1815 were obviously autocratic in nature. They didn't tolerate criticism, they didn't tolerate dissent, and they sought to curb activities that questioned the legitimacy of autocratic governments. Most of them imposed censorship laws to control what was said in newspapers, books, plays, and songs. They discouraged the ideas of liberty and freedom associated with the French Revolution. The memory of the French Revolution, however, continued to inspire the liberals further. One of the major issues taken up by the liberal nationalists who criticized the new conservative order was freedom of the press. This return to autocracy meant that there were multiple restrictions on what people could say and what people could do. They could not promote the ideas of nationalism and liberty and were forced to be silent about the lack of representation in government. Thus, most of Europe was taken back to a system of government which had existed prior to the French Revolution. Over here, political and military power was once again concentrated in the hands of the monarchy and the nobility. And this led to many liberal thinkers going underground and becoming revolutionaries. During the years following 1850, the fear of repression drove many liberal nationalists underground. Secret societies came up in many European states to train revolutionaries and spread their ideas. To be a revolutionary at this time meant a commitment to oppose monarchical forms of government that had been established after the Vienna Congress and to fight for liberty and freedom. Most of these revolutionaries also saw the creation of nation states as a necessary part of the struggle for freedom. It's evident that many educated people were unsatisfied with the decisions of the Congress of Vienna, and they wished to introduce the principles of liberty and equality back into society. They had very nationalistic ideals and did not want to accept the monarchy as the absolutist rulers of the land. We'll now be learning about one such individual who became a revolutionary, namely Giuseppe Mazzini. Giuseppe Mazzini was born in Genoa in 1807 and he became a member of the secret society of the Carbonari. As a young man of 24, he was sent into exile in 1831 for attempting a revolutionary in Italy. He subsequently founded his own underground societies, namely Young Italy and Young Europe. The members of these societies were like-minded young men from all across Europe. Mazzini believed that God had intended nations to be the natural units of mankind, and so Italy could not continue to be this patchwork of small states and kingdoms. It had to be made into one single unified republic within a wider alliance of nation states. Following this model, many other secret societies were also set up all across Europe. Mazzini's relentless opposition to the monarchy and his vision of democratic republics frightened the conservatives. Duke Metternich, who was the convener of the Vienna Congress, once described him as the most dangerous enemy of Europe's social order. With people such as Mazzini gaining popularity in society, new revolutionary ideas began to spread all across Europe. We will now be learning about the age of revolutions between 1830 and 1848. These revolts and uprisings greatly changed the political and social structure of Europe, and many of the institutions that were created during this time still exist and are still used today. The conservatives who wished to restore the old absolutist institutions such as the monarchy and the nobility began to consolidate their power after the Vienna Congress of 1815. The ideas of liberalism and nationalism came to be increasingly associated with revolution in many regions of Europe. These ideas began to spread to other regions as well, such as the kingdoms and states in Italy and Germany, Ireland, Poland, and even provinces of the Ottoman Empire. These revolutions were led by the liberal nationalists, who belonged to the educated middle-class elite. They included professors, school teachers, clerks, and members of the commercial middle classes such as merchants and traders. Thus, it was these educated middle classes who were unsatisfied with the return to absolutist government who started to spread their revolutionary ideologies. Europe would now face several years of revolution in various regions over the next few decades. The first great upheaval took place in France in 1830. The Bourbon kings who had been restored to power during the conservative reaction after 1815 were now overthrown by liberal revolutionaries. These liberals established a constitutional monarchy with Louis Philippe at its head. After 1815, Louis Philippe was the person who became the king of France and he was supported by the conservatives. The July Revolution also sparked an uprising in Brussels, which is in modern-day Belgium, which led to Belgium breaking away from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Duke Metternich, once again, when all of this was happening, he remarked that when France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches a cold. The growth of revolutionary nationalism in Europe also led to a struggle for independence amongst the Greeks, which began in 1821. Now, it's evident from Duke Metternich's remark that the conservatives were extremely worried about the development of nationalist feelings in France. The establishment of a constitutional monarchy meant that the French king no longer held absolute power. It seemed that once again power was being transferred from the king to a unit or to a body of people's representatives. Now, this idea of nationalism and this idea of transfer of power was very likely to spread to the rest of Europe. We will now be learning about the Greek movement for independence and the influence that it had on Europe during the 1820s and the 1830s. An event that mobilized nationalist feelings among the educated elite across Europe was the Greek War of Independence. Greece had been a part of the Ottoman Empire since the 15th century, for more than 200 years. Nationalists in Greece got support from other Greeks living in exile, and also from many West Europeans who had sympathies for ancient Greek culture. Poets and artists lauded Greece as the cradle of European civilization and mobilized public opinion to support its struggles against the Ottomans, which was a largely Muslim empire. Finally, the Treaty of Constantinople of 1832 recognized Greece as an independent nation after all of this struggle. Greece is revered as the cradle of Western civilization because it was where great philosophers such as Aristotle, Plato, and Pericles created modern institutions like democracy, the republic, and the judiciary. All of these are still used today. Until 1832, Greece was under the control of the Ottoman Empire, and the people of Western Europe, especially artists and poets and storytellers, believed that the people of Greece must gain their independence from a largely Muslim empire. Now we will learn about the role that culture had to play in the revolutions of the mid-19th century. The development of nationalism did not come about only through war and territorial expansion. Culture played an important and crucial role in creating the idea of the nation. Art, poetry, stories, and music helped express and shape nationalist feelings. Romanticism was a cultural movement which sought to develop a particular form of nationalist sentiment. Romantic artists and poets generally criticized the glorification of reason and science and focused instead on emotions, intuition, and mystical feelings. When we think of romantic today, we immediately think of love stories. However, in the 1800s in Europe, romantic was used to describe a fantasy or a mythology. In order to develop feelings of nationalism among the people, various art forms such as music and plays were used. It was easy to use these platforms to convey the message of nationalism to the masses and to create a sense of unity among the citizens. This was because most people were uneducated at that time, and it was easier to convey things through these stories and through poems and things like that rather than through a textbook or through some explanation. Their effort was to create a sense of shared collective heritage, a common cultural past as the basis of the nation. Other romantics, such as the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, claimed that the true German culture was to be discovered among the people, and he called it Das Volk. It was through folk songs, poetry, and dance that the true spirit of the nation, or Volksgeist, was popularized. Collecting and recording these forms of folk culture was essential to the project of nation building. The emphasis on vernacular language and the collection of local folklore was not just to recover an ancient national spirit, but also to carry the modern nationalist message to large audiences who were mostly illiterate. Like I said before, the majority of people in Europe were uneducated peasants or serfs during the early 19th century. It was difficult for the educated middle class to convey the ideas of nationalism to the masses directly. Thus, they began to use folk songs, plays, and poetry to convey their revolutionary ideas. We'll now look at the emergence of nationalism in Poland and how language, the Polish language, played a major role in its emergence. Poland had been partitioned at the end of the 18th century between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Even though Poland no longer existed as an independent territory, national feelings were kept alive through music and language. Karol Kopinski celebrated the national struggle through his operas and music, turning folk dances like the Polonaise and Mazurka into nationalist symbols. Language too played an important role in developing nationalist sentiments. As you remember, Poland had been completely taken over by the various powerful European nations after the Congress of Vienna. However, the people were determined to reclaim their identity. We will now see how the Polish language was used to counter Russian rule over occupied Poland. After Russian occupation, the Polish language was forced out of schools and the Russian language was imposed everywhere. In 1830, an armed rebellion called the November Uprising took place against the Russians. However, this rebellion was ultimately crushed in early 1831. Following this, many members of the clergy in Poland began to use the language as a weapon of national resistance. Polish was used for church gatherings and for all religious instructions. As a result, a large number of priests and bishops were put in jail or they were sent to Siberia by the Russian authorities as punishment for refusing to preach in Russian. The use of Polish came to be seen as a symbol of the struggle against Russian dominance. Many great Polish writers and thinkers had to escape Poland after the rebellion. However, they continued to use Polish folk symbols and the language as a means of resistance against Russian rule. The people of Russian-occupied Poland continued to be repressed for the rest of the 19th century, but they continued their struggle throughout and never gave up their national symbols or their national language. Now we come to an optional section of this chapter on the Grimm brothers from Germany, who used their folk tales and stories for children to create a united culture among the German people. Grimm's fairy tales is a fairly familiar name because it includes famous stories such as Rapunzel, Little Red Riding Hood, and Hansel and Gretel. The brothers Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm studied law, but they soon developed an interest in collecting old folk tales. They spent 6 years traveling from one village to another, talking to people and writing down fairy tales which they handed down through generations. In 1812, they published their first collection of stories. Subsequently, both the brothers became active in liberal politics, especially in the movement for freedom of the press. The Grimm brothers also saw French domination as a threat to German culture and believed that the folk tales they had collected were expressions of a pure and authentic German spirit. The Grimm brothers are another example of writers and thinkers who were liberal nationalists and called for the end of absolutist rule. Today we see their stories as fairy tales for children, but in the 19th century it was seen as an example of German nationalism and a call for unity within the German-speaking regions of Europe. We'll now be discussing the struggles of the poor and the middle class against the absolutist leaders and the conservatives who ruled many regions of Europe. In the 1830s, it was a decade of great economic hardship because there was an enormous increase in the population across Europe. In most countries, people were jobless as they had very less employment. People from rural areas migrated to cities and they had to live in overcrowded slums. Small producers in towns were faced with stiff competition from imports of cheap machine-made goods from England. In the regions where the autocracy still enjoyed power, peasants struggled under the burden of feudal dues and obligations that they had to pay to these local lords. The rise of food prices and bad harvests also led to widespread pauperism, or people becoming poor over a short period of time. Even in India during the 19th century, people struggled due to the import of cheap machine-made goods from England, where industrialization was far more advanced. This drove more people into poverty all across the world. In Europe, weaving and cloth making were carried out in houses or in small workshops, which were put out of business completely. Peasants who lived under aristocratic rule mostly lost their jobs due to industrialization at this time, but they had to continue paying taxes to their feudal lords. This was in addition to rising food prices due to bad harvests in rural areas, and this led to a lot of difficulties all across Europe. In the year 1848, food shortages and widespread unemployment brought the population of Paris out on the streets in protest. Several barricades were erected in Paris, and Louis Philippe was forced to flee the country as he feared execution. A national assembly proclaimed a republic, granting suffrage to all adult males above the age of 21, and they guaranteed the right to work. National workshops were set up to provide employment to those in need, and Louis Philippe was the last person to rule France as a monarch. Louis Philippe had been restored by the conservatives in an attempt to revive the monarchy, France. However, due to poor economic management along with bad harvests and rising food prices, he was forced to give up the crown and escape from the country. We'll now be talking about the revolutions among the middle classes and how they greatly influenced the spread of nationalism throughout Europe. The events of February 1848 in France resulted in the abdication of the monarch. That is, Louis Philippe had to give up his crown and give up all of his privileges. A republic based on universal male suffrage had now been proclaimed. In countries such as Germany, Italy, Poland, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, men and women of the liberal middle classes combined their demands for constitutionalism with national unification. They took advantage of the growing popular unrest to push their demands for the creation of a nation state based on parliamentary principles such as a constitution, freedom of press, and freedom of association. Once the monarch was forced to abdicate his crown, which means he had to give up his privileges, like I said, the people created a republic based on universal male suffrage. Thus, all men above the age of 21 could now vote for representatives and they could stand for elections. They wanted to be governed by a constitution which was agreed upon by everyone. They also wanted freedom of the press so that they could criticize the government, and they wanted the freedom of association, which gave them the ability to protest peacefully. In the German-speaking regions, many political associations whose members were part of the educated middle class came together in the city of Frankfurt and decided to vote for an all-German National Assembly. On 18th May 1848, 831 elected representatives marched in a procession to take their places in the Frankfurt Parliament, which was convened in the Church of St. Paul. They drafted a constitution for a German nation, which was supposed to be a parliamentary monarchy, which meant that there was going to be a king, but there was also at the same time going to be a parliament which had elected representatives. They offered the crown on these terms to Frederick Wilhelm IV, who was the king of Prussia at the time. He, however, rejected it and joined other monarchs to oppose the elected assembly. The people who belonged to the German-speaking regions of Europe always wanted a united nation of their own. Looking at the events in France, they decided to hold parliamentary elections of their own. Many businessmen, professionals, and artists came together to elect representatives, and they believed they could convince the king of Prussia to be the new head of this nation. They wished to have a monarch but a parliament also. The parliament would be the highest authority. However, the king of Prussia refused and he opposed the elected representatives. While the opposition of the aristocracy and military became stronger, the social basis for this new parliament had completely eroded. The parliament was dominated by the middle classes and they resisted the demands of workers and artisans, and they lost their support as a result. Without the popular support of the workers and artisans who made up the majority of the population, the parliament was no longer seen as a legitimate authority by the majority of people. In the end, the military troops were called in and the assembly was forced to disband. Thus, the German-speaking regions could not introduce a complete republic within their territory. Germany was incapable of completely removing the monarchy from its territory, and we'll be studying more about German unification in the next chapter. The issue of granting political rights to women was controversial within the liberal movement. Large numbers of women had participated actively over the years in revolts and demonstrations against absolutist leaders. Women had formed their own political associations, had founded newspapers, and taken part in political meetings and activities. Despite this, they were denied voting rights during the election of the assembly in Germany. When the Frankfurt Parliament convened in the Church of St. Paul, women were admitted only as observers to stand in the visitors' gallery. Women had played a major role in multiple uprisings and revolutions across Germany and across Europe. However, they were never given any voting rights because most men in the liberal movement as well saw women as being caregivers who didn't need to lead active political lives. The struggles for women's rights in politics continued into the 20th century, after which many countries granted the right to vote to women. People who are aware of and support women's economic, social, and political rights are called feminists, and this is a little important to remember. Though conservative forces were able to suppress liberal movements in 1848, they could not restore the old order of absolutism. Monarchs were beginning to realize that the cycles of revolution and repression could only be ended by granting some concessions to the liberal nationalist revolutionaries. Hence, in the years after 1848, the autocratic monarchies of Central and Eastern Europe began to introduce the changes that had already taken place in Western Europe before 1815. Thus, serfdom and bonded labor were abolished both in the Habsburg dominions and in Russia. The Habsburg rulers granted more autonomy to the Hungarians as well in 1867. In Central and Eastern Europe, the conservatives managed to hold on to their power even after 1815 and 1830. However, they had to grant many rights to the liberals during this time. They abolished the feudal system and introduced reforms in education and in food distribution. Thus, even though monarchies continued in these regions, they could no longer exercise absolute power over the people. We will now be studying about the emergence of Germany as a nation state. This is part of the next section of this chapter, namely the making of Germany and Italy. We will only be studying about Germany in this part of the lesson. The making of Italy and the emergence of Great Britain as a nation will be dealt with in the next video. After 1848, nationalism in Europe moved away from its association with democracy and revolution. Nationalist sentiments were being used by conservatives for promoting state power and achieving political domination over Europe. Previously, we've studied about how nationalist feelings were widespread among middle-class Germans. In 1848, they tried to unite the different regions of the German Confederation into a nation-state governed by an elected parliament. However, this was suppressed by the combined forces of the monarchy and the military, supported by large landowners who were called Junkers from Prussia. Thus, the conservatives knew that nationalism was a powerful ideology that could unite people, and they began using it for their own advantage. After suppressing the German attempt at creating a parliament with a constitution, the conservatives began to create their own institutions based on nationalism. They began to unify Germany using military power. From then on, Prussia took on the leadership of the movement for national unification. The chief minister of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck, was the architect of the process of German unification. He carried it out with the help of the Prussian army and bureaucracy. The Prussians fought 3 wars over 7 years with Austria, Denmark, and France. Prussia managed to win all 3 conflicts, and this ended in Prussia emerging as the victors. Thus, Bismarck, along with the Prussian military, managed to complete the process of unification in a very short period of time. Otto von Bismarck was often called the Iron Chancellor of Germany because of his political strategies and his ability to win multiple wars in quick succession. Once Germany was unified, Bismarck managed to stay at its head and create a peaceful environment for almost 20 years. However, his policies and his tendency to be aggressive set the stage later on for the First World War. On 18 January 1871, an assembly of German princes, representatives of the army, and important Prussian ministers, including Otto von Bismarck, gathered in the Palace of Versailles to proclaim the new German Empire, headed by Kaiser William I of Prussia. The nation-building process in Germany had demonstrated the dominance of Prussian military and state power. The new state placed a strong emphasis on modernizing the currency, banking, legal, and judicial systems in Germany. Prussian measures and practices often became a model for the rest of Germany. Thus, German unification was complete and solidified with military strength. Decades of nationalism amongst the German people had ensured that Germany finally got its own territory and sovereignty. Thank you so much. With that, we come to an end of the second part of the chapter. Today we learnt about the defeat of Napoleon and the emergence of the conservative ideology after 1815. We studied the differences between liberalism and conservatism and the rise of revolutionaries as a result. We also learnt about the emergence of nationalism in Greece and Poland and how language and culture played an important role in these countries. We studied about the revolts by the poor and the middle class and their importance to the achievement of liberal nationalism throughout Europe. We also touched upon a little bit about feminism in this chapter. Finally, we studied about the creation of the German nation with the help of the Prussian military. In the next lesson, we'll be studying about the formation of Italy and Great Britain. We will also be covering the topic of visualization and allegories of nations. Finally, I will also be talking about nationalism and imperialism in the late 19th century. Thank you so much for watching. If you thought this video was informative, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment with any questions or doubts that you might have, and don't forget to share this video with your friends. I've been Sumant Kumar, and thank you so much for watching this video.